Thank you for joining the AAN Applying to Adult Neurology Residency webinar in 2021. All participants are muted. If you have any technical difficulties, we recommend disconnecting from the webinar and reconnecting. Connect using computer audio or by the dial-in feature. You do not need to use both. If you continue to have technical difficulties, send a message through the chat feature and we will try to assist you. For questions to the panelists, please use the Q&A feature, not chat, and we will answer them throughout. I'm pleased to introduce our panel members for today. Our moderator is Dr. Lyell Jones Jr., Program Director at Mayo Clinic. Our panelists are Dr. Erica Schuyler, Program Director, University of Connecticut, Dr. Charles Flippen II, Program Director at UCLA, Dr. Leticia Program Director at the University of Miami, Dr. Saher Choudhary, Program Director at Prism Health, Dr. Raymond Price, Program Director, University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Jessica White, resident at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Jenna Miller, resident at University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Katrina Lim, resident, University of Connecticut, and Dr. Dylan Del Papa, resident at the University of Miami. Dr. Jones, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and hello, everyone. Welcome, and we appreciate you joining our 2021 Adult Neurology Program Director and Resident webinar sponsored by the American Academy of Neurology. As Lucy said, my name is Lyell Jones. I'm the Program Director at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And we're really thrilled that we have this special opportunity to have dual perspectives tonight for the 2022 match applicants to neurology from both program directors and residents. And our goal tonight is to make this as useful as possible for you. While the pandemic has disrupted many aspects of healthcare, as we all know, especially medical education, one of the most salient impacts has been on medical students and other applicants to residency. Students in particular are on a very structured career development timeline and are entering the 2022 match faced with decisions about where to train based largely on virtual and word of mouth information. Our goal again this evening is to demystify the virtual application process as much as possible and offer some general tips that we think would be applicable in any residency selection season to be as useful for you as you work through your process this fall and in the spring. The panel we've put together for tonight, I think, is pretty extraordinary. We have a group of program directors who not only lead wonderful programs, we have national award winners, AAN board members, National Education Committee, and consortium leaders. More importantly, and this is the most important part, I hear consistently from other leaders in our field and the residents in these programs that these PDs, these program directors, really truly do have their trainees' best interests at heart. And I think will give us a wonderful view of the application process from the program director side. I'm very grateful they volunteered their time for tonight's session. The neurology residents who have similarly offered a portion of their day for this are also pretty amazing in and of themselves. They not only bring a passion for neurology, but they have something that really no one else can bring to this discussion, including the program directors. They have direct and personal and professional experience with a virtual application process, either for residency or for fellowship. So we have from our residents and this evening a variety of perspectives, some from the PGY1 perspective, having just done the match last year. They are not as ensconced in their neurology programs, but they again have direct views of the application process. And we also are fortunate to have a senior resident with us who can talk about how the virtual fellowship application process went, which has some obvious parallels to what the viewers of this webinar will be working through this season. All of the program directors, all of the residents on the session tonight love their programs. They're proud of their programs, and that's wonderful. Our goal tonight, though, is to give you a broad perspective on the application process. So the enthusiasm you hear, and I think you will sense that enthusiasm, is for neurology the best specialty. So congratulations on having chosen neurology. You will not hear program promotions. These are not going to be sales pitches for our programs. We really are going to be applicant centric tonight, demystify the application process, and mitigate some of those extraordinary circumstances that the applicants are in this year, and maybe even find a way to enjoy the application process because it is kind of fun. So thank you all. I have a couple of things I want to call out here. We really appreciate the viewers tonight who submitted questions. We have more than 100 questions that were submitted through the registration process. Plenty to have a moderated discussion and fill, will probably more than fill our time. We will not have the ability, just because of the size and scale of this group, we have a lot of participants on the call. We won't be able to do an open Q&A, but if you do have thoughts or comments to share, please feel free to put them in the chat function. We will keep our eye on those as best we can. We also have some helpful links and resources in the chat that we'll call out as we go through the session tonight. So do have a look in the chat box. Some specific thanks to, I'm looking around the screen here, Lucy Persad and Allison Perales at the American Academy of Neurology for sponsoring this and really making it come together and helping it work. InMatch 2022, which is one of the social media accounts, as many folks viewing tonight are aware, helped aggregate some questions, and in particular, Jenny Liu was instrumental in pulling those together and curating them into really a nicely organized set of content for us to review. And again, finally, our panelists, really grateful for their time. So we're going to get right into it with our program directors. We're going to spend about the first half of our time tonight discussing questions with program directors, and our resident colleagues will step into the background. And about 45 minutes after the hour, we'll have our residents come back. Our program directors will step away, and we'll have a more resident focused discussion at that time. So, a question that I think is relevant any year, because I think this is a question that comes up, I know, when I mentor students and applicants who are preparing to apply to neurology residency. And I'm going to open this up to the whole group. A common question that we saw in the social media submissions, as well as the registration process, is what goes into a holistic review process for an applicant? Are there score cutoffs? How do we approach applications? So I'm going to open that up for our program directors if anybody wants to take a shot at that.
I can take a shot at it. So hi everyone, thank you again for joining. So when we approach the application process with a holistic review, what that means is that we do not use any kind of cutoff scores. We look at the whole application as a whole. So let's say somebody would have a lower score on step one, that would not exclude that application. We look at their research, we look at their service, their leadership, we look at letters of recommendation, everything together. We look to see the character of the applicant, the passion for neurology, and then we use sort of those measures, not any kind of grades or ranking of medical school, and not looking at step scores.
Thank you, Dr.
And
well put. Go ahead, Dr. Flippen.
yes, and so I agree with Dr. Tornes that cutoffs are the direct opposite of what you're trying to achieve with a holistic review. Holistic, we want to look at the entirety of the person. We also look at where did someone exhibit grit? Where do people show up as leaders? We know that test scores do not determine the quality of physician, and definitely not the quality of neurologist that you will be throughout your career. And so, yes, it's a matter, and it takes more time, but I think we all feel that it is worth that time to really look at everyone for what they have done, not what they've done over the course of 4 hours of taking an exam, but what have they done in the years that they've worked to get to this point. And so really it's a matter of honoring everyone's path.
Well put.
I would
Go ahead,
agree
Dr.
with
Choudhary.
I think the other thing that I would add is we also look at life experience as, how do you measure grit? How do you measure resilience? Is a very hard thing, I think, for anyone to really do. And so we look at kind of the obstacles and the difficulties that people had to overcome to get to where they are today. So that's also part of the holistic review. And for me, as everyone else has said, the numbers, the actual scores on step 1 or step 2 are not relevant. It's simply, do they meet have they passed, essentially? And often we don't even get the step 2 scores until later after the interview. So it's not really relevant to the actual initial application interview process.
So I have a related question, and Ray has come off of mute, and I'll let him handle both of these. So that's a great segue, Dr. Choudhary. Thank you. Another question that we've had that I think relates to this holistic review question is, will programs consider step 1 scores in this process, knowing that we're moving to a pass-fail for those scores? And I think that's a very fair question. Some will have a score, some won't in the future. Ray, I don't know if you have a comment about that specifically or about more the holistic review.
A couple comments about both. One of the things I was going to say is I want to emphasize what Charles said, that the holistic review takes a lot of time. And so there's a lot of anxiety. You submit your applications, you're anxious to hear from programs about what they're interested in. Are you going to get an interview? But recognize that the programs who may take a little longer to get back to you are actually spending more time with your application, reading it from cover to cover and trying to figure out how good of a fit you would be. So it will feel paradoxical to you because you'll feel like, well, I haven't heard from them. That must mean they're not interested in me or not interested in my experiences, but it actually runs counter to that experience. And I just wanted to emphasize that key part that makes applicants very anxious. I think we switch to, I don't look at step scores prior to offering interviews. So we make it totally blinded to step scores. I think a lot of programs have moved in that direction, and it just makes sense to do that since you're going to have less step scores available in a year. So I think you're fortunate applying to neurology that I think we have a lot of buy-in from our programs about holistic review and about the de-emphasis on standardized testing. And so it's not universal. It's not going to be true of 100% of programs, but I think it's way more true in neurology than, say, other, I won't name them, but historically highly competitive subspecialties in medicine.
Yeah, and Ray's being diplomatic here. He's not going to name any specialties that rhyme with orthopedic surgery, for example. And we'll move on from this. If we could talk about this probably for the whole session. I think another thing to be aware of as you look at programs is some programs may have a distinctive mission or vision, and maybe thinking about your application, your story, your cover-to-cover review of your application based on that program's focus. We focus a lot on leadership in our program, so we're looking for leadership potential. Many programs are looking for clinical potential, scientific growth, things of that nature. So be thinking about that and how well it aligns with your own personal goals. We have a distinctive issue this year, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Schuyler on tonight, who's an expert on this and has helped craft policy. One of the questions we got in the social media submissions was, will interviews be virtual this year? How are programs approaching second looks? We did not have second looks last year, at least officially. And so that's a little different from last year. And I want to give her the floor to talk through the Academy's position and kind of her expertise. So Dr. Schuyler, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us. And I hope that this will be helpful information for everybody. We put a lot of time into putting together a consensus statement. And what a consensus statement is that we contacted all of the programs and got their input. So the statement that we put together, which I believe Lucy is going to post in the chat, which, yep, she just did post in the chat, is something that I hope all of you will read carefully. We put a lot of time into advice for both programs as well as applicants in this upcoming season. So what we did was in looking at sort of the the state of the pandemic, as well as the state of travel restrictions, especially from other countries. We have obviously a huge part of our workforce in the US, as well as a huge proportion of our trainees who are residents and fellows are international medical graduates who are not training or doing medical school in the United States. So that adds an extra challenge, as well as the state of vaccinations around the world right now. And it just really is not realistic, I don't think, at this time, especially with the current state of the surges going on in many parts of the country, to have in-person visits. And obviously that's fluctuating over time and by geography. So really for the sake of both equity as well, as fairness and safety of our applicants, as well as everybody involved in the application process, we have come to a consensus across programs that this upcoming season be all virtual. And we did, when we put together the statement with the AAN, we sent the statement to every single program. And I think there were other committees we sent it to, but I think there were at least 600 people who reviewed the statement and needed to reply whether or not they approved and had some feedback, or just completely did not approve of it. And I think out of the 605 constituents we sent it to, I think we had 4 respondents not approve. So it was an overwhelming consensus. So I would be very surprised if there are numerous programs that are saying that they're offering in-person visits. Now that's for the interviews. At the time we put together the position statement, all of these surges weren't happening yet. We put this together in June, and by the time it got approved and went through all the various stages of everybody reviewing, it was the end of July. So it really, this happened before we had the latest surges, but even then, in terms of second looks, obviously there's nobody out there that is going to enforce or penalize a program for having some type of in-person visit plan. That's not the role of the AAN or any other sort of, group of neurologists. We're not really policing this in any way. But the recommendation from the AAN is that we strongly recommend that the entire season remain virtual. Now, it was not as much of a consensus for virtual only second looks when we got feedback from all of the programs. So it was a much more mixed, everybody was in agreement that the interview should be virtual, but it was not a total consensus in terms of what programs were thinking about doing. That may have changed in the past 2 months, looking at how things have changed with the pandemic. But in terms of recommendation from the AAN, if there are programs that do feel that a subsequent in-person visit is necessary and they are arranging something for some type of in-person experience, that the recommendation in terms of our overall position, and everyone was in agreement for this, was that should be to the benefit of the applicant only and designed in a way as to avoid impacting the program's ranking of the applicants. So really, if there is some type of in-person visit offered, it shouldn't be required. It shouldn't factor into how someone is ranked. And it's really for the sole purpose of the applicant gaining necessary information for making decision about their ranking. So hopefully that answers the question, but I encourage all of you, if you haven't read it already, to review the statement in detail.
That's a great summary of a really well thought out piece of policy, which, you can't make everyone happy, right? I think it's one of these things where you do the best you can with the information you have. And we all know the pandemic is a fluctuating crisis, and circumstances certainly could change. Any other thoughts or comments? I have a couple of follow-ups on this point, but any other additional points from our PD group when it comes to, the decision to do virtual, whether or not to do second looks, and how applicants should anticipate that for the season? Right.
Yeah, again, I can't speak for all programs. I think that second looks, as Erica said, should really be for applicants who feel like they need that piece of information to make a decision for themselves. We all recognize that these are highly expensive experiences to have to travel to one or multiple places. I am planning to offer them to applicants, but I'm going to say about 1 million times in every applicant session that they are totally optional. They do not affect your ranking. And in fact, you won't meet with me or associate program leadership during those. And I think that's going to be at least the way a lot of programs treat these, which is You can meet with the residents, you can get a sense of what the experiences are like, you can get a sense of a city, but really it's only if you need that extra information. Last year we did all of this without second looks, and I will hear from the residents later, but it seemed to work very well. And so please don't feel obligated to do these. These are quite time consuming, quite expensive, and a program shouldn't be using this as a sign of interest.
And I think, and I'll get to Dr. Flippen here in a second, different folks are going to approach this differently from a program level and an institutional policy level. There's a lot of layers of policy here that are going to be impacting that decision. We have decided not to do second looks, mostly from an equity perspective. That's something that Dr. Price just touched on, which we think is important. And that's one way for us to be kind of level set across the board. And I think that's in line with the policy and the flexibilities that Dr. Schuyler outlined. Dr. Flippen, and then we'll go to Dr. Choudhary.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones. We have been pondering the circumstances and the best way to ensure equity pretty much since the last interview season ended. And as Dr. Jones sort of alluded to, it's not just in the hands of the program directors, but we all have our graduate medical education apparatuses on our campuses. Right now, we're being discouraged from having people come to campus. Before that, the surge that we're in currently and that opinion came out, we were considering having our ranking before the date that we would allow people to come for second look, so that there would be no way in the world that second look could have an impact on the ranking of our applicants. And I just think that that's another way in which we can ensure equity in the process for everyone. And it all depends on how your calendar is constructed, if you can do that and still allow time for people to come. We're on the left coast, and so for people to move all the way across the country from an East Coast school, typically you do want to kick the tires of the place that you're going to live for 3 years or more. We understand that uncertainty, but we also want to be fair to everybody. So, right as it stands right now, we will have only the virtual experience and no in-person contact.
Multiple ways to do the right thing. And
Yeah.
I think good intent is really something that you should expect across the board. Dr. Choudhary, and then we're going to ask a related question here.
Yeah, I actually echo everything that's already been said. We did virtual second looks last year, but I did want to just comment on the fact that I had several candidates email us and ask if they were to come on their own to check out the city, if they would be able to come to the hospital or to the clinics and kind of be able to tour. And we did say no to that for a couple of reasons. One, it went against our COVID policies, but also it does impede that equity that we're all looking for. So I think it's tough. It's tough for the applicants. I kind of feel that the programs actually, at least I felt like I got a better sense of the candidate with virtual than they got a sense of the location and the area. As Dr. Flippen said, they're moving for the next 3 to 4 years of their life is going to be spent in that area, and they're not going to get a chance to come and go to dinner and see the areas and things like that. And so I did tell them that if they wanted to come and drive through and check out the city, check out the area, feel free, but we would not be allowing them to come to the clinic or the hospital. So I think just that came up in last year's conversation. So we're kind of incorporating it into our discussions with candidates at the beginning this year.
Well said, Dr. Choudhary, and I think a few good points in there. The virtual process worked a lot better than I think many of us expected it would, in terms of how well we felt like we could get to know the applicants. I do think that and I'm going to echo something Dr. Price said. If you're interviewing with a program, the program is going to presume that you're interested. And you really don't need to do a virtual or in-person second look as a demonstration of interest. And I'll look for shaking heads versus nodding heads on that. But I think that's probably a broad consensus among the program director community. A related question I have, and I might ask Dr. Tornes's thoughts on this. is, we do see differences in applicant and program decision-making in terms of numbers of interviews. And on the applicant side, number of applications. When you, Dr. Torrance, when you think about the number of interviews you're doing, did you do more last year, fewer last year? And if so, how are you approaching it this year?
Yeah, great question. So definitely because the volume was higher, A, and B, we weren't really sure how it was going to play out. We did a 30% increase of interviews, which was nice. We were able to sort of feel comfortable that we were going to interview enough people and get a really good picture, because we weren't sure how the interaction, like you said, was going to be. But again, I do feel confident that we were able to really get to know the applicants. So I do want to put everyone at ease that's listening right now that we tried it last year. It worked very well. We're very happy with all of our candidates. I think you'll hear from the residents later. I think that they also were able to sort of get a picture, not only during the interview, but perhaps many of us had open houses or webinars or sort of a cocktail on the night before the interview, sort of mimic that restaurant experience when you were, pre-COVID interview day. The other thing, because we have now a whole interview season that we have, experienced, this year, I probably will still interview a couple of an increased percentage, but it won't be 30%. I'm thinking maybe 10% extra, because it was probably unnecessary. But again, I think going back to the holistic review, I did get a lot of emails last year from applicants asking, when we were going to let them know. But because of the increased number of applications, keep that in mind that it might be a little bit longer for us to sort of let you all know who we've decided to interview or not.
Very good point. We were delayed last year because of letters and just, it was a little more chaotic. And again, this will be a different year. I think Dr. Torrance has probably got a representative approach, I think, to many programs. We just saw so many more applications last year. I'm going to get Dr. Schuyler here in just a minute to weigh in on this. We saw so many more applications that we ended up interviewing a few more people than we ordinarily would have. And we are thinking about this from the program side. Dr. Schuyler's put a lot of thought into this from the applicant side about, what is that magic number? What should applicants be thinking about in terms of, and no single number is going to apply to all applicants or all circumstances. We know that different people have different comfort levels, but what are your thoughts, Dr. Schuyler, on how many applications are appropriate?
Sure. So this is really, I think, a really, really important issue. I think if you talk to program directors, which I do frequently talk to a lot of our colleagues, and the thing that programs are worried about the most is that applicants are going to apply to all of the programs. So there are some specialties out there where every single applicant applies to every program in the country. And that's really scary to us to think about every single applicant in the whole country applying to every single program. And that's sort of an extreme view, but the number of applications that people have submitted year over year has gotten sort of more and more if you look at the data. Now, we took a deep dive into this when we put together our advice for applicants. Okay, so if you look at the match data, and that's really the best place to look, and you look to see how many programs people are needing to rank in order to match, it's very low. Okay, and so I encourage all of you to look at the NRMP website and look at their data for neurology. And I hope that reassures you. There are also several tools available. And we mentioned the position statement. There's in the AAMC website, there's something called the Apply Smart site, and you can basically enter your own data specialty, and it kind of gives you a recommendation about the number of programs you may need to apply to. Now, just for individual, each person, obviously everybody's different. They all have different applicant characteristics. So what I'm going to talk about is a generalization. So I don't want anybody to take this as the absolute number that you as a person should apply to this number of programs. This is a generalization based on reviewing the data. And basically in last year's match, so that's the match that was all virtual, where people did apply to more programs than they typically did in previous years. The mean number of programs ranked by candidates who matched in neurology was, it was close to 13 for MD seniors and 11 for DO seniors. So that's sort of where the curve approached 100% match rate. Okay. Also the percentage of interviews you're going to get, it is going to vary from applicant to applicant based on sort of the competitiveness and then the volume of applications that each program is receiving. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a difference from program to program. But basically, it's a very high percentage of people that are interviewing for a program that will end up on the rank list. Okay, so I encourage you to read it carefully. I'm not going to go through every iteration here, but the bottom line was that we don't really think that if you are a US MD grad, that you really need to be applying to more than about 20 programs. I think that, and for DOs, it was slightly higher than that when looking for the data. It was a little bit harder to calculate just in terms of US versus non-US IMG applicants. It was a little bit harder to kind of make a distinct recommendation because the data that we had going into it wasn't as clear. But in terms of applications, it really for the USMD applicants, they really don't need to apply to more than, we actually came up with the number 23 kind of from doing the math, and you don't need to rank more than 13 programs. So that's a generalization. Obviously, like I said, that's not an individual recommendation for any one person that's attending this webinar, but just kind of think about those general numbers when you're applying. Now, I think in terms of the, getting a feel for programs, we have put ourselves out there. So I think that's something that you would not have seen 2 years ago. So programs have just put their programs online. We've made virtual interviews of our hospitals and our cafeterias and our Starbuckses and our, we have testimonials, we have interviews with our faculty online, we have interviews with our residents online, we have social media accounts, we have Instagrams and Twitters and you name it. There is so much information about our programs that's available to you from your computer screen that I'm hoping that you will be able to at least narrow down the programs that hopefully, and I don't know, that you'll get the vibe of a program to some degree from our online presence. So that's really the hope of all the programs, is that you can get some sense of what we're like, our culture, our residents, from all the stuff that we're continuously posting on social media and everywhere, that you can narrow down at least to sort of a reasonable number of programs. We're talking about holistic review. And so I read every single application. I believe, all the program directors here, we read our applications. And in order to do a holistic review, it has to be a reasonable number. So I think that that's something that's really important that I wanted to convey to all of you. I love reading applications, and I might not say that come, come October 30th when I'm reading them for a month straight. But, I really, I put the time into reading your applications carefully, as do the rest of the program directors. And I think it's really important that if you're applying to our program, know that we're putting that time in. And so really try to, make sure that you're, that you're interested in us. And so, obviously cast a wide net if that's something you're looking to do geographically. But, I think, applying to more than you need to, or double or triple the amount of programs that you need to in order to match, overall will kind of hurt the process.
Thank you for that. I think that's a great synopsis of a complex issue. A lot of great questions in the chat. Dr. Flippen has started to take on a couple of those. I appreciate that, Charles. One that's related to this from someone named Anonymous Attendee. If we are in the area of a program and want to look around, is it okay to reach out to that program and ask if we can tour, or is this a violation of match protocols? And I think my general response to that, and folks can agree or disagree before we move on to a couple of important areas here. If you're asking a good faith question, just ask the question. It's not a violation to ask a question. We are on your side here. We really do want to help you end up at the best program for you. And we can't, we can't control where people go just to look around. Even if you have a program or an institution that is not doing second looks, if you want to look at the neighborhoods, if you want to look at schools, if you just want to get a sense of the atmosphere of a community, that's something that's certainly within your purview to do. So we could talk about this for the rest of the session too, but I want to make sure we cover an important area. We had a lot of questions both on social media as well as in the registration request regarding issues that are specific to international medical grads, which are particularly complex in pandemic and virtual application seasons. And one of the questions I thought was very, very well framed was, what are the challenges of applying in this application cycle without the benefit of U.S. clinical experience, and how are programs thinking of that for our international colleagues, and how should applicants be thinking about that? And maybe a parenthetical I'll add, and we'll let whoever wants to jump in on this do so. With or without U.S. clinical experience, and if there's been a long gap since graduation. I've seen that come up in the chat box a couple of times. So anyone want to take a shot at that important area for our attendees tonight?
I can.
Dr. Tornes, yeah, go for it.
Charles. So definitely we know that because of the pandemic, you are not able to. It's not even an option. So we are definitely taking that into consideration. There are virtual opportunities. I think that was another question somebody asked. Would a virtual observership or a virtual U.S. experience? I would say absolutely. I would consider that a U.S. experience because, again, there is no other option at the moment. But I do want to put you at ease that we understand that you are not able to, and you might not be able to get that neurology letter. So all of that is taken into account when we're doing our holistic review, and we can, take a look at what it is that you're able to do, whether it be in your home country, et cetera.
Yeah, and I agree with Dr. Tornes as always. And with regard to gap from graduation to application, really it's about we look at what have you done with that time, and have you remained engaged with clinical medicine? Because when you start residency, you will start taking care of patients again. And we want to just make certain that those muscles are still in shape, and that when it's time to perform, that there isn't this tremendous amount of activation energy that's needed. So really it's a matter of what have you done with that time. It's not really a matter of a particular number of years that would make someone less desirable or more desirable.
Perfect. Thank you both. I have a question that I'm going to throw at Dr. Price. He doesn't know I'm going to throw it at him, but I'm mostly doing this because I forgot to mention that Dr. Price is joining us from vacation, so I think he gets extra points for attending tonight. Multiple questions here in the chat, in the Q&A, as well as prior to the session tonight about personal statements. And we know this is a big part of the application. It's something that applicants put a lot of time and thought into. What goes into a successful personal statement from your perspective, Ray?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think the number one thing is, depends a lot on your application and what your goal is. Sometimes I think you want to have your mentors read your personal statement. Ideally, they should look it over and give you some advice on it. I think that in general, many of the personal statements sound pretty similar. They talk a lot about why neurology, and they talk about kind of how you got to where you are, whether, what kind of distance traveled you may have, what kind of experiences led you to this direction, and kind of those type of things. And I think that's all critical, and what we can't get from necessarily your letters, or unless the letter writer really knows you incredibly well, and what we can't get sometimes from your activities, and certainly we can't get from your standardized scores or your grades on your transcript, et cetera. So really it should be an opportunity for you to tell us some things that we can't find anywhere else in your application. I think that often is super helpful and makes me reconsider an applicant that I was not thinking about when reading the activities, et cetera. But people have different circumstances that may have challenged them, and therefore kind of creates the real key to the holistic review. So I think it should be about yourself. It should kind of be additive and not just a replication of what you have already put in your activities. And it's not a subtle way to kind of remind people that you did 25 things. Pick the things that were most meaningful to you and emphasize them. And you don't have, I think I saw a question about, should it be personalized to the program? If you're applying to 23 programs, you should not feel obligated to personalize it to the program. I think you should, we all recognize that you're using a similar statement, and really it's our ability to get to know you better. And that's the number one thing you should be using it for.
Well said. And I saw enough nods that I think we might move on to a new question here. Thank you, Ray. And I might get Dr. Tornes's opinion on this. We we have this question every year. Neurology has this somewhat peculiar arrangement of its design where you can match into a program categorically, where you spend all 4 of your years in one spot, or you can match into an advanced program where you do your PGY 1 year in one place, and then your 3 years of neurology somewhere else. And some, like my program, have a little bit of both. You can do your advanced match where you do your PGY 1 elsewhere, or categorical all 4 years here. It's complicated, and sometimes it's even the terminology breaks down because you can have an advanced match, but you still do all 4 years in one spot. Dr. Tornes, do you have any general advice to our applicants about how to think through that and what the priorities should be when they're considering which programs they're applying to?
Yeah, definitely. So I think if there's a program that you're really passionate about and you really want to go, so let's say Dr. Jones's program, and he has both of those types of programs or positions, that gives you 2 opportunities to match into that program. So you want to apply to both categorical and advanced. Let's say you want to pick X program and they have both categorical and advanced. What I tell the applicants is you put number 1, that program categorical, number 2, that same program advanced. Again, giving you 2 opportunities to sort of match into the program. The caveat is if you are applying to advanced positions, you must also apply to preliminary positions. And this has happened in the past. I know residents has happened too, that they on match day, they're very excited, they match into neurology, but they did not match into a preliminary year. So keep in mind, if you are applying to advanced positions, you also must apply to preliminary. Some of the questions I saw in the chat was, do you need to have a different personal statement, different letters? You do not. All of the preliminary programs know that you need that year as a requirement to become a neurology resident. So that's okay. You do not need to have extra, but you do need to apply to those programs. And again, based on your scores and your application, you have to apply to, depending on how many programs. There is another designation that's called a advanced preliminary with a link. So it is a linked position. So you apply to a program and the PGY 1 year is guaranteed. So it's essentially a categorical position, but it's just named differently in the NRMP, and it will show up as a neurology linked to a prelim year. It's very confusing.
Very confusing. That's probably one of the best summaries I've heard of a complicated process. I'll demonstrate a little bias here. You've all chosen neurology, which is the best specialty there is. That first year is important. It is foundational. It is not nearly as important as where you do your 3 years of neurology and how well that fits, your personal goals. And it's really not about the best program in the country, is it? It's about the best programs match for you. And so that's a personal bias that I have. I do think it's better spent thinking about the 3 years of neurology than the first year, which often works out if it is unmatched. Statistically, it usually works out that the SOAP process or scramble kind of sorts that out. So we are about 2 minutes away from closing out with the program directors. And before I reiterate my thanks to them, a fun question that we got was from social media. Any application pet peeves or definitely don't do this? And you may not have any, but I think folks are always careful to think about that. And Dr. Choudhary, do you have any particulars that you would recommend not to do?
Yes, I would highly recommend not using your cell phone to do the interview. I had a couple of candidates actually last year who were using cell phones, and not because of computer issues, because we did have the backup of moving to a cell phone or FaceTime if the computer was glitching. But they started out with the cell phone and there was constant movement. They were holding it in their hand. It was shaky. It was, and the candidates were actually strong and they gave very good thought out answers to a lot of the questions. But the thing that everyone remembered was how difficult it was to watch them, that it was actually provoking motion sickness in some people, how much it was shaking. So I strongly recommend do not use cell phones and FaceTime or your apps on your cell phone.
Sage advice. Dr. Schuyler?
Yeah, I'm going to agree about thinking about what might be distracting to the interviewer. So I think that's probably a main point to think about, how you do your setup. If it's a plain white background, you're against the wall, that's fine. I think a lot of applicants worried last year about their lighting and making sure and practicing looking like at the camera versus not. And I would say, don't worry about that. Don't worry about exactly where you're looking on your laptop. Everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody else is distracted by their own picture if they have it up. And, you know, we're used to interviewing on Zoom now. So I think it makes sense to do some practice. But I would encourage you to keep your background either sort of neutral or plain. I think, you know, I was distracted a little bit last year. People had messy rooms behind them. So I think, if you are planning on interviewing, if it's your personal space, it's your bedroom, that's fine. But to turn the laptop sort of towards the wall rather than towards, you know, an unmade bed or laundry and stuff like that, I think, you know, just in terms of professionalism, that, you know, just keep it less distracting.
Well, we're at the time for our program director crew. What a great group. I'm just deeply grateful for the expertise and the time this team has volunteered. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know our attendees are grateful for you having been here. So we'll ask you all to step off, and we'll invite our residents to come on. And for the balance of our time here, we'll take about 45 minutes or so and give you kind of the real scoop on the process. And again, the 4 residents that you see with us on the screen know things that really no one else, including the program directors, really know. They know how the process worked, and they have a lived experience that I think is very rich. And I've already benefited from hearing from some folks who have been through the process. And so I'm really excited to have this special time with them. We have a variety of perspectives here from different programs. As you can see next to their names, we also have their PGY year. Our PGY 1 colleagues will be in their preliminary year, their internal medicine year, but have just gone through the process, and I think can speak very richly to that. Dr. Lim is a PGY 4 resident and has done a virtual fellowship interview process, which is a little different from the match. We might hear from her a little bit about her experience. But has that senior resident view, which is really distinctive and unique. So thank you all for being here tonight. This is great. PGY 1 year, PGY 4 year, it's pretty laid back. You don't really have a lot of time commitments, right? So this is easy to take a chunk out of your evening to be here, right? You had nothing else going on. If I hear any pagers go off, is that something I should worry about? No one's holding a code pager, right? Good. So let's get right to it. There are many questions that we discussed with the program directors that you all could speak to as well. But there are some that are just really can only come from you. And we ended on a couple of questions about virtual interviews. Personally, if somebody had a little bit of clutter in the background, that gives me a sense of them as a human being, and it doesn't bother me per se, but folks often do think carefully about the visual presentation of the virtual interview. I'm going to just open up the floor to the 4 of you, and you can come off of mute if you want to speak to it. Tips for a virtual interview process. So we heard don't do a phone, but do you need an elaborate backdrop? Do you need equipment? Do you need lighting? What from looking back, what's your take on it?
I think lighting is good, having some like a backlight, because it can be challenging to get proper lighting. I don't know necessarily that it's important or essential, but I had a ring light for myself. You can get one on Amazon for about $20, $30, and I found that just a simple way to make sure that I had proper lighting on my face. Also, I think most people like plants. I can see from the panelists, the majority of us have plants in the background. I stuck one in the back behind me. So that's just like, I guess that's also personal preference for my own background.
So it looks nice, and it's kind of a subtle message that you can keep something alive, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. That's always good. That's a good message.
Yeah.
Other suggestions, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, so I did not use the ring light. I didn't find it necessary. But one thing that I didn't think about beforehand was kind of in those interviews that are longer, that might be, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Think about the fact that the sun is going to move and just sort of where the light is in relation to your camera, because there were some where I started off kind of looking normal in the beginning of the day. And then by the end, when the sun is behind you, it looks like one of those like anonymous interviews and you can't see your face. And I found that a little distracting. So maybe just think about how to set up your light for the longer interviews beforehand.
Yeah, we might get back to that. That's a good segue for later, maybe into how do you deal with a day that's that long? It's a really hard day if you're sitting in front of your screen. As far as the virtual process goes, everyone's worried about the IT failure. I think most programs are going to be very understanding if you have an internet outage. This is just going to be something that we all saw it occasionally, and it doesn't reflect on the candidate. Any troubleshooting or planning that you all did? I know some schools, when I did interviews last year, some schools offered some on-site locations for interviews. I think probably most of the applicants I saw were at home. Dr. White, what was your take on that?
So I actually interviewed from my medical school quite frequently, and part of that was situational. And I think if your school has that option and you do not have access to a quiet space, that's a great option. I have two very young kids, and I was afraid they might, for lack of a better word, photobomb my interviews. So I chose to do at least the interview portion at the school. But even that being said, there was one day where we had some internet connection issues, even though I was attached to a medical center, and everybody was really understanding. I wound up doing a phone interview for one of them, which obviously is not ideal. I did have an interview on my phone, but I did try to rest it on something stable so that you didn't have that kind of nauseous feeling. And then it came back for some of the later interviews. And I think that a key point to take away from all of this is that everybody is finding grace in this whole process, and everybody is anticipating and preparing for things to go wrong. And I don't think that people will hold it against you for that happening. And, while you do your best to kind of look ahead and prepare for anything that may go wrong, which in my case was interviewing somewhere other than my house, so you didn't get a picture of my kids running behind, I think that things happen and it'll be okay.
Well said. And I didn't prep with Dr. White on this, and she probably isn't going to know I'm going to say this. If a kid photobombs your interview with me anyway, I can speak for myself. You win the interview, right? I mean, that's just fun, and again, that's who we are as people, and I can see how that might make an applicant feel uncomfortable if there's a distraction in the background or the dog starts barking, but that's life. And I think a program that doesn't appreciate or understand that is going to be the exception and not the rule. So I do agree
Jones,
with Grace.
My kid photobombed the pre-interview dinner.
Awesome.
So it did happen. Yeah, she crept upstairs and said goodnight to everyone, all of the residents.
Oh, that's fantastic. So
it
you
does
won
happen.
the dinner. You won the dinner. But I know from some of our residents, when they were going through the fellowship application process early on, I think it was before a lot of programs learned how exhausting it can be to sit there for a day. And we had the good fortune for our interview process to learn from some of those mistakes. And we did not try to transpose an in-person interview day onto the virtual setting, because again, it doesn't translate well. So we did try to make it shorter. But I do know that some fellowship programs, couldn't adapt or that kind of thing. I'm curious about Dr. Lim's experience. When you applied for fellowship, first of all, which fellowships did you apply for, or what subspecialty, and any perspective on the virtual process from what you learned?
So I recently applied, or am currently applying to a specialty in movement disorders. So I just finished all my interviews for movement disorders. And I'm not sure if my experience was too different from, of the rest of the PGY1's experiences. Although the one thing that was new to me was group interviewing. So the programs would have all the candidates sort of in one breakout room, and we would do group interviews together. So that was something new that I hadn't experienced before, especially when interviewing in-person residencies. I didn't have that group interview experience before. And another sort of new experience was, my day was also 8 to 5, but that was largely due in part to because of the availabilities of the interviewers. So I would have 1 hour breaks, I would have 2 hour breaks, I would have 15-minute breaks. So it really varied. I'm not sure if the residency programs are like that. I think maybe in fellowship it's a little bit different, but that was also something new, because when you interview in person, it's one set day. So there's always something going on. But when you're interviewing something virtually, you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of time. So your day kind of depends on that.
Thank you. And again, congratulations on movement disorders. It's a great subspecialty of neurology for any applicants who aren't aware of how diverse our specialty is. Something like 23 or 24 different fellowships that you can think about in neurology, and it really is internal medicine of the brain. And I can say to Dr. Lim that from our residents applying for fellowship, they had a similarly wide range of experiences. Some days that were 8 to 5, some that were more broken up, some that were more abbreviated. So I do think you should be prepared for a diversity of structures. I didn't hear a lot, or I haven't heard about a lot of group or panel interviews from the resident side, but that's a good point, that is something that could arise in the application process for this match season. So I want to move on, and we might come back to application kind of virtual challenges. Social media really did become a much more conspicuous tool, not only for programs, but I think also for applicants in the last application cycle. And for obvious reasons, right? We have relatively fewer ways to reach an applicant, and applicants have relatively fewer ways to learn about programs. So social media became much more visible. It is not everyone's favorite thing to do, though. And we have an expert tonight with Dr. Del Papa, who was involved with development of some of that work. So I want to get Dylan's perspective here. You know, is social media, so is it an option, or does it come standard now? Is it something all applicants should do? And if so, how should they approach it?
So it is an option. I think it's a good option if you have the time, and it can be time consuming. So there are other ways to network, but social media has presented itself as a really efficient way to network across the country with various people that are also interested in neurology. I think a good place to start would be following the NMatch account. There's also been a recent initiative published with the Neuro Twitter network, which outlines basically how to create a Twitter account, which accounts to follow, what to look out for. So that would be a great place to start. But I think social media and kind of the utilization of social media and over the past 2 years has been a great way to kind of even the playing field for a lot of people who may not have otherwise had access to some of these mentors that have gone on to social media. And I think it's kind of your opportunity as applicants, and also if there are some other MS3s on here as well, to get involved early, network, interact with these mentors. I think most of the mentors who are on social media are very willing to interact with you and answer questions. So don't be shy and try to put yourself out there if you can and you have the time.
Well put, Dr. White.
Just to add to that, I think one of the things that I guess got lost a little bit in the virtual interviews, and it's just by nature of it being virtual, is really getting to know your cohort of fellow interviewers. you always hear about people that you meet along the interview trail and that you rode home with or shared a cab with or an Uber nowadays with. And I think that that's something that, by nature of everything being virtual, kind of you miss out on a little bit. But this is where I think social media has come in to be really handy. So Jenna and I, and actually Dylan and I, a couple of us have all interviewed together, and I now follow them on social media. So I feel like I got to know them a little bit better without ever actually having met in person. And I wasn't a big social media person prior to interview season, but I think that there's definitely a multifaceted benefit to it. As Dylan mentioned, mentorship, but also to kind of build relationships with people who are going to be your potential colleagues down the road.
And it kind of works after you arrive. I learned this on social media about Dr. White. I did not learn it from her in person, that she and her family bought a house. And congratulations on that. So it is something that does have some long-term value. Dr. Miller, and then we'll probably move on to a different topic here. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I agree with everything Dr. White said. I also just wanted to say I'm not a big social media person, and Twitter was something that I found like uniquely, I'm not sure if this is specific to neurology, but I found that uniquely useful. And I actually created a Twitter for the first time. And it was also how I found out kind of about a lot of these first look Zooms to sort of tailor how many applications I was going to send. And those were things that I don't think I would have found without Twitter.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. I think there's different ways to interact. I can speak from one program's perspective, my own, but I think many think the same, that it is a useful option. You can use it passively to learn about programs. It is 100% not a disadvantage if you are not active on social media, and that's a double negative. But you really shouldn't feel like you have to do something that feels unnatural or uncomfortable to you to make yourself a more visible or viable candidate for programs. It's something that you can use to learn. You can use it to mentor. The Neuro Twitter network is a fantastic resource. But as programs have adapted to this environment, there's much more online. There's a lot of in person, either by email or by phone or FaceTime interaction that you can do with programs to learn about them, to try to close those gaps. So a useful option, but I wouldn't feel, if it's not your thing, I wouldn't feel obligated. So a question that we heard this from a few folks in both the social media submissions as well as in the registration questions. You all have the perspective of, at least our PGY1 colleagues have the perspective of being in the program now. So having at least on-site, not in neurology yet, but on-site, and comparing that to your virtual perception of those programs. And this doesn't have to be necessarily positive or negative, but were there any surprises? Were there any things that you think would have worked better with an in-person interview? Any things that you showed up and you were like, wow, this is not something that I expected, and maybe that's because of virtual. Thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I bought a house actually via online shopping, is how I like to describe it. So I had never actually seen it in person. And I enrolled my kids in daycare and preschool without ever having stepped foot in these institutions. And I think I was pleasantly surprised in a lot of ways. But I think in general, most cities and most towns, you often liken to what you've already been exposed to. And I think if you've never been in that specific city, there's always going to be bits that surprise you, whether it's the layout or, that sort of thing. I wasn't necessarily surprised by the institution, except for how large it is. But I think, you have to be prepared to be surprised, because in a way you will form opinions about places based on just pictures. But I don't know that they were necessarily any bad surprises, just kind of like, oh, this is how I pictured it in my head. And it's a little bit different, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And just being comfortable in a little bit of the unknown and knowing it'll all work out. Okay.
And it really does. I think that's an important message, and that's a very affirming message. Having done it the old-fashioned way, I can say that even if you do do an in-person interview, that is a very small snapshot of an institution and a community, and you learn more about it as you become acclimated. And as we heard from the program directors earlier on, it really is a pretty good replacement, or at least substitute, for an in-person interview to do the virtual. I think you do get I think we, at least as programs, feel like we got a very good sense of our candidates, and I think it probably went both ways. Dr. Miller, Dr. Del Papa, any surprises from your perspectives?
So I'll echo what Dr. White was saying as well. I mean, I didn't buy a house, but I rented my apartment all from virtual images, virtual tours. And I think what's great about this whole process is kind of we're all trying to do things virtually. And so there's a lot more resources than there otherwise would have been to be able to, for example, buy a house or rent an apartment from across the country. But again, the surprises are going to be there, whether you get to see it virtually or whether you're in person. And I think this question is good to continue asking to as many people as you can who have been through the process. And it's probably a good question to ask even on the interview trail to the residents as well, because that might give you an idea of what a gap between your interview experience and what you might be able to expect if you actually match into that program.
So very well put. I want to get all four of you in on this as well. But before I open it up to all of you, I think Dylan hit on a very important point. And again, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of a personal bias here. The residents are going to give you the straight story. When you're on the interview trail, the residents, what they tell you is the source of truth. And that's not to sound divisive but sometimes you get a different perspectives from the program director, from the faculty, from the residents. The residents are living the life that you're going to live. And I think talking to them in social settings or even in a formal interview, that resident perspective is hugely valuable. And I'm probably have seen a couple of nods here that's true. A question that I want to ask all of you, looking back, you all have about a year's worth of perspective from the beginning of the application cycle last year. Things that you wish you had known then that you know now. In other words, some things that, looking back, you'd say, wow, if I had known this or prepared this in a different way, or maybe if I didn't worry about this as much as I was, and I might throw that at Dr. Lim as well. But I really would like to hear from all of you, things that you know now that you didn't know last year that we can pass forward to our attendees tonight. Dr. Miller.
I think this is something that's probably true of every interview season, but especially virtual, is it can be hard to remember that it's a two-way street and that you are also interviewing the program. That was something I wish I had remembered a little more. It can be easy to just kind of focus on yourself and your presentation, but you really are interviewing the program as well. And I guess in the virtual setting, since you're not on campus and you can't look at the facilities that you're wondering about, and you're not having your memory jogged with your questions, something that I started doing by the end was typing up a list of just my don't miss questions in case the day flew by and I realized I didn't get a sense of something, or there was something that I definitely wanted to know before the day was over. And it was just nice to have something to kind of pull up in those breaks between interviews and make sure that not only was the program getting a sense of me, but that I knew everything I felt like I needed to know about the program.
Super important point, right? It's not just about you presenting yourself as a strong candidate. This is your opportunity, right, to learn, to have the program convince you. I think that's a very fair point, and I think it's easy to forget that from the applicant's perspective. Other lessons learned, things that you all wish you had known a year ago that you know now. Dr. White.
Sure. I mean, I think to just kind of call out the giant elephant in the room that we're all interviewing in the middle of a pandemic, and that is hard and that is super unusual, but also everybody's in the same boat. So this experience is not unique to just you as an applicant. So any of your worries or fears that you have about how the pandemic is going to negatively affect you is probably similar for many of the other applicants as well. So to try not to stress so much on, you know, the giant situation that's going on in the world right now, at least from an application perspective, and know that everybody's in the same boat, and it'll all be okay.
Very good. Totally agree with that.
And then another thing personally to add to that would be kind of when you start to come up with all the metrics that you want to take into account when you do finally, as you're deciding which programs you want to apply to, and then once you get interview offers, as you're deciding how to rank your rank list, metrics probably will change and move up or down in terms of how important you find them to be. But I think now, having started the program, I have a better idea of what things I think are the most valuable. And so I would say don't discount having residents that are supportive and seem kind of to get along with one another. I think having that support group is super important because obviously residency is going to be a difficult time in your life, and you want to have that support, not only with your residents, but also your leadership as well, your program director, your associate program directors. So, you know, don't discount that kind of, I guess, the softer metrics that really do make a difference in your experience.
And again, it's not perfect, but I do think that the virtual medium does pretty well at that. You can get a sense of, do the residents get along? Do they have the kind of interactions and sense of community that you're looking for? And again, it all depends on what the applicant's priorities and metrics are, to use your word. But I do think you can get a sense of that, and it's very fair to look for that and expect to be able to learn that during the virtual interview process. Very good. So a question that I think is important, I mean, we didn't really touch on this as the program directors, but I'm interested in this group's perspective about letters of recommendation and how you approached. We have a lot of questions in the chat here about letters of recommendation. How many and who do you ask, and how did you pick the person who was writing your letter, and in neurology versus outside of neurology? What's a good way for applicants to think through that process from your perspectives?
I guess I think if anybody offers to write you a letter, I think that's usually a good sign. And you should probably consider taking them up on it. But beyond that, I tried to look for people that I had established a relationship with, people that I maybe had reached out to earlier on in my career. And then also people who I think were able to speak more about me than just what I think programs would garner from my application, who knew me a little bit more than just how I interacted with patients, although I wanted to make sure that they did see me in a clinical setting, but were able to speak to like the multifaceted aspects of my application and maybe some things that weren't even present in my application. I know that's really tough sometimes, and not everyone is going to know that much about you. But I think it's always good to have, you know, somebody in neurology, but if that's not possible, just speak to someone that you think would represent you in a way that may not show up on paper.
I totally agree, and that is a good clue. If someone offers to write, it's usually because they have something meaningful and informative to say about you, and probably is going to be favorable and positive, which obviously that's kind of appealing too. Dr. Miller, Dr. Del Papa, Dr. Lim, your perspectives on, how much neurology should be in those letters, how much outside of neurology, maybe a different rotation that you did that was where you feel like you contributed and you had a good, meaningful interaction. Dr. Miller.
I agree with everything that was said. I think that if you're at an institution where you maybe don't have as many opportunities to get multiple experiences with multiple neurologists, it's totally fine as long as maybe have at least one. But even if not, I think programs are very understanding during the virtual season. I think 3 out of my 4 letters were from internal medicine. And that was just because those were the people that I knew had longitudinal experiences with me that could speak the most to me. So I think as long as you strive for people that know you well, anything kind of goes.
Very good point. And also there are some disruptions here, right? So some rotations have not been available because of the pandemic. And again, the programs are factoring that in, and we understand these things. And if you feel like there's a particular gap, you can explain that elsewhere in your application or discuss it at the interview phase. Dr. Del Papa.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think if you're gonna have to decide between a letter of someone who is a neurologist who doesn't know you very well, or has a big name in medicine and doesn't know you very well, I would versus someone who knows you and has had a longitudinal experience with you, I would say always pick the latter. I think it's great to have neurology letters of recommendation. I had a total of 0 neurologists write me letters of recommendation that I matched. So it's definitely possible. I would say definitely mostly focus on having a physician who has seen you in a clinical setting and has something to write about you.
Dr. Lim, question for you. You have that distinctive position here. Neurology senior residents are the only folks who know neurology, and they also know how the system actually works. So, as you look back from a more senior perspective on the application process, ways that you would have approached the application process, and obviously the virtual is maybe aside from that, things that you would look at differently from your perspective now.
That's a really good question, actually. I was a very, very anxious applier. Admittedly, I applied to a lot of programs because I was very worried that my, application wasn't strong enough. But looking back, I really just felt like I had to have a lot more confidence in myself. And to really, the first question that I had to ask myself is, do I want to go here? And that really pared down my list a lot, because I was applying to places that I had never heard of, but it was a number on a list and it made me feel better. But if I was offered an interview there and I actually went to the interview, if I got accepted there, would I really want to go to that place? Not just the program, but also the city. You should really be honest with yourself and ask yourself the question of, will I enjoy what the city offers? Because work is only really a part of your day. There are so many other hours outside of work that you have to fill with time outside of studying. And in this era where the rate of physician burnout is growing, these are important questions to ask. Do you see yourself being happy there for at least 3 years? So I think looking back, I was very happy with my choice. Ultimately, personally for me, it came down to whether or not I would be happy in a small institution versus a big institution. And I also have a family with me as well. So a lot of those personal sort of nuances come in when making your list. And it's really important to consider that. I think those are 3 really big questions that I wish I stressed upon more when I was applying to programs. Do I want to go here? Will I enjoy what the city offers? And do I see myself being happy here for at least 3 years?
That's the voice of wisdom. Very well put. It is useful to think about, again, not the best program in the country, but the best program for you as the applicant, right? Those are 2 different questions, and the latter is more important than the former. There's a really good question in the chat box that I wish I had thought of myself. what questions did you commonly get asked during interviews that it would be important to make good answers for, or have some good prepared answers for? Conversely, what were questions that you found useful to ask to get a better feel from the program? This is a great question from anonymous attendee who's asking a lot of good questions over and over. But what does the group think about that? Let's start with what are some in the pocket questions that you need to have an answer ready for and still sound like it's the first time you've ever answered it?
So you're almost guaranteed to get in almost every interview why neurology. So if you don't have a solid reason, if you get stumped on that question, it's going to be tough to get out of that one. So I would definitely recommend hammering down some key points. What has drawn you to neurology?
That's a good one. And to be honest with you, I personally have gotten a little bit away from that one. I still ask it sometimes, but boy, you must get tired of answering that question, right? Other questions that you just got to be prepared for. What does everybody think? Dr. Miller?
I think this one is also maybe obvious, but why us and why you? So at almost every institution, they want, like Dr. Lim said, you need to have a good reason why you're applying there, and you should be able to speak to that. And then I think it's also good to sort of practice not bragging about yourself, but you might get asked, why should we take you? And sometimes that's something that you might want to rehearse beforehand. It can be uncomfortable to sort of toot your own horn. So that was something that I felt maybe caught off guard by the first couple of times that I was asked that.
Dr. White?
I think if you've had an interesting path to medicine, be prepared to talk about it and how it might relate to your current pursuits. But then in addition to that, I think I was often asked a lot about an interesting case or an interesting patient I saw. So I think that's something that you can kind of prepare in advance and maybe have a couple to kind of rotate through, but ways that you can kind of speak, how you take a question and good interviewing, and then you go, okay, and then this shows something about me too. So that's something to kind of think about in advance of what's an interesting patient you saw, how has it informed your current career choices or your current path to medicine, or how it has changed you as, to make it very profound. So think ahead.
Very good. Dr. Lim?
I sort of got in fellowship, a lot of what I was asked was, what can this fellowship do for you, or what is your ideal fellowship? And so I would kind of rearrange that question. What is your ideal residency program? Also be prepared to be asked if there is any specialty in neurology that you're interested in. And I want to let you know that it's okay to say, I don't know, especially if you haven't seen a lot of neurology. And I always tell my juniors, it's okay to have an open mind. I came in thinking I wanted to do epilepsy, and I'm applying for movement disorders. So it's okay to say, I don't know to that question. You don't have to know exactly what you want to go into when you go into these interviews.
So we're here for resident perspectives, but I'll give you a program director perspective that perfectly aligns with that. The universe is wide open to you in neurology. There's not only different subspecialties, there's different settings, there's different geographies, there's different populations. It's really so flexible and versatile as a career choice. It's okay to have no idea. It's okay to have an idea and acknowledge that it might change. I do think it's helpful to demonstrate that you at least have a vision for yourself somewhere in that space, right? And I think anyone who's done this for a while understands that things not only can change, they almost always do change. Maybe Dr. Lim had decided on movement disorders 4 years ago, but I'm going to guess maybe she hadn't. I don't know. And so when you get that question about, where do you want to go, you can acknowledge the uncertainty. But if you do have a well-articulated vision for yourself, it just shows that you've put some thought into what you're doing. And that usually comes across very well. Let's flip it around. What did you find that you had any secret, awesome, insightful, killer questions that every time you asked a program this, you got a great insight? Did you have any of those, or was that too nerve-wracking to think about kind of a pointed question for a program?
So first of all, I think it might be kind of nerve-wracking to come up with questions for the programs, but it's going to happen. Again, probably in every interview, you're going to have to be answering or asking questions of the programs. And I think this virtual season has actually made it a little more difficult on us because there's a ton of time to get information from programs. You have open houses, you have the actual program day where they very efficiently present you with information. And then also the pre-interview happy hours tend to be less so geared towards small talk and more so geared toward pointed questions about the program, which is great. Obviously, it gives you a lot of time to gather information, but it can kind of limit how many questions that you still have left by the time you're in the interview. So I think one question that I found the most useful and maybe least often addressed during those other portions was asking about what type of changes the leadership had envisioned for the program. I think that can give you a good sense of where the leadership hopes to go with the program in the next year, next 5 years. So that'd be my advice. That's one of many questions.
It's a great way to flip it around, right? Not only have you thought through your career, has the program thought through its own future? And so I think that's a good way to, and I think that's a very appropriate question. Other killer questions that the group found useful was there a question that you wanted to ask, but you just never got up the courage to do it? Dr. Lim.
I always ask about what is the culture of the program and what are some improvements that the program currently has or is working towards. What does the program currently lack that they're working towards improving?
Also very good. I will say that having some questions, it's sometimes it's exhausting. You've gone through an interview and then at the end, they're going to ask you if you have questions. It does show that you have learned about the program and you have interest if you do have those questions. However, and this is, I'm speaking more for myself than necessarily everyone, you shouldn't feel like you have to manufacture a question just to sound interested, especially at the end of the day. And sometimes I'll try to let people off the hook and say, you've been doing this for several hours now. Literally every person you've talked to has asked you if you have questions. If they're all covered, they're all covered. I think that's appropriate. But I do think not only do you owe it to yourself to have all of your questions answered, like Dr. Miller said a minute ago, it does show that you put some thought into the program that you're interacting with. Dr. Miller?
Yeah, and just if it's the end of the interview day, one thing that I found helpful if you don't have any more program specific questions is just to ask a person specific questions. So like, what is your favorite thing about the program? Or, maybe not what changes are already being implemented, but what is something that you would change that hasn't been changed yet? And everyone will have a different answer to that question.
Very good one. Dr. White?
So I will kind of go back to like what you mentioned about not necessarily feeling like you have to answer or ask a question. Because Dr. Jones, I think with you were my last interview of the day. And I said, you know what, I've got nothing. And I reiterated things that I liked about the program and had learned about the program during the day. But I think a key point to take away during this whole interview process is to be completely authentic. And I think that will really shine through. And if you have no questions because you didn't do research on the program, that's going to read. But if you have no questions because you've done an abundance of research and there's so much available online and there's videos and all sorts of things, and it's the end of the day and you've asked tons of questions, I think it's okay to kind of just try and, as Jenna mentioned a little bit too, just try and spark conversation about something else. And that may kind of inform your decision in different ways without it being a pointed question.
Well put. I wish I'd written that down. That was a very thoughtful summary. And I think authenticity is a really important characteristic of a physician. And as much as you can convey that in the process, I think that's helpful. And you should expect to get that back. You should get a sense of authenticity from the people you're talking to and the programs that you're talking to. We've got less than a minute left. Funny stories, mishaps, disasters, something that you didn't think you could hold it together. You read about this sometimes online and you'd hear some some funny stories. Anything crazy happened in the interview trail?
I mean, I could speak to my daughter photo bombing, but bombing the pre-interview dinner at Mayo, which is where I wound up. So it all worked out okay, but she was in her underwear. I mean, fortunately she had her underwear on, but that was it. She just came in and said, "Mommy, I want to say goodnight. Are these your friends? Hi, everybody." So I was mortified at the time. I saw her just kind of slowly open the door and creep in. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is happening right now. This is like the CNN moment of the anchor whose kids are wandering in the background, and it's happening. But I think at the end of the day too, use those opportunities as an advantage to show how adaptable you are and how you can react under pressure and react to the unexpected and kind of roll with the punches. So try and make good of what could potentially be a scary situation.
And try to have fun, right? And we haven't talked about that much tonight. Enjoy this process. This is a major decision in your lives. You're all embarking on wonderful careers. You have everything in the world to look forward to. It is stressful. I'm not going to pretend that it's not, but you have every expectation to enjoy this a little bit and learn a lot along the way. And I had not heard about the photobombing, but that was probably pretty fun all around. I bet everybody enjoyed that. So we're at our time. Before I turn it over to Lucy for some final comments, I do want to remind everyone attending tonight that this has been recorded, so it will be available later for, we did have a really good attendance tonight live, but for folks who want to review it again later, it will be available. I want to reiterate my thanks to the program directors earlier, but really especially what a great rich discussion with some experts who are living the residency life and have done the application process and can speak to it with an enormous amount of authority. Thank you, all four of you, for taking time out of the busiest schedules around to be with us tonight. We know that in our hearts, our applicants are going to have a wonderful application season. It's going to work out. Wish you all the best, and I'm going to turn it over to Lucy for a couple of final comments.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. So thanks everyone for joining our session tonight on applying to adult neurology residency in 2021. This webinar, as Dr. Jones mentioned, was recorded. Once edited, it will be available on AAN.com. We will let you know when it's available. Look for information on our social media channels on an upcoming webinar on applying to child neurology residency and how-to Twitter sessions. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.